guys, here with another video. Today I wanted to do something a little bit more fun and something a little creative. Name generators are something I've written a few of them, and it's one of the more fun subsystems of any app or game you could write. I find it has a lot of space for creativity. Because I've done it multiple times and it seems like something I've repeated, I thought I'd kind of lay out a template of how I would do it, how I have done it, and use that as a jumping point for talking about some basic Godot concepts and how you can use resources to generate a pretty powerful chunk of code that's maintainable, pretty easy to understand, just uses some basic random number generation strategies to get cool fantasy names. So let's jump into it. What we're going to talk about is just building a basic name generator. The requirements will be that it'll generate a string in the first name, last name format, and we're going to start very simple and then iterate. Alright, so here's my template application. What we have to start is a main screen, which has a shuffle button and then a label. When the shuffle button's tapped, we'll generate a new string, and this label will be updated with the new string, which I'll illustrate here. So you see the new string is an empty string. Why is that? Well, the reason is because on button press, the text gets updated to the generate return string, which will always be an empty string. Okay, so the first iteration of a random name generator, we're going to want to return it in the first name space last name format. So the most naive thing we could do is have an array of first name and last names. So here's some pre-cooked fantasy human first and last names. And what are we going to do? We're going to take a random element from array 1. So let's do that here. Var first name equals first names, and all arrays have a pretty useful built-in function called pickRandom, which will use the global random number generator to pick a random index and return the value. And we'll do the same thing for last name. Last names, pickRandom. And then rather than return the empty string, we're going to want to return a string format. So if you've never seen a format string before in Godot, it looks something like this. Use the squiggly braces and you either put in a key in the dictionary or an index in an array. So I'm going to use an index. So index 0 space index 1. And now I have to pass in an array. So I'll say format. And the array will have index 0 and index 1. Get rid of this comment, and then let's play. Alright, so that was a very basic example. We're going to jump into the next part really quickly now, but before we do, we're going to talk about resources. Now, Godot resources are a whole nother topic. There's lots of videos out there explaining how they work and what they are. But I'll just go over the very basics that you need to know before we go on to the next part. Almost everything in Godot is either a node or a resource. Now, what separates resources from nodes is they can easily be saved to the disk, so they can be serialized and deserialized very easily. They'll only be loaded once, so if you attempt to load it again, it'll actually just be creating a reference to the initially loaded resource, the same instance, which is really nice to have. You can almost think of it like a singleton pattern. They can contain export properties, just like nodes, but they're missing some node lifecycle callbacks. For instance, they don't get called ready like nodes are, and they can't be added as a child of a node. So what we're going to do with a resource is we're going to basically take those arrays of first names and last names and store them in a nice resource where they can be edited and referenced in the Godot IDE without digging into code. So let's see that now. We're back in Godot, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new script. We're going to call it name definition. Let's open it. So name definition is going to extend resource. I'm going to set the class name to name definition. And all it's going to contain is two exported variables. First names and last names. And why don't we make those typed? All right, so if we go back to our file explorer and we create a new resource, we will see name definition is now one of the options, and we can make a new definition. Let's call it human names. Let's save that. Double click. And we now have two editable arrays where we could add in all our names. So I'm going to do that and we'll zap ahead. Alright, so I entered these 3 first names and 3 last names, and as you can see, it was actually a little time consuming. I had to add an element to the array, fill it in, and then repeat. So we're actually going to show you how to skip this step and make it a little bit more user-friendly to quickly edit our arrays of names, but we'll get to that in a moment. So I'm back at my main script, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete these 2 arrays. And I'm going to add an export variable called name definition of type name definition. So for now, I'm just going to return empty string again. So because this is an export type, when we select the node that corresponds with this script, you'll see there's now a name definition here. And we could quick load our human names. So we're now going to enter almost the identical code as before. It will now reference name definition dot first names pick random and name definition dot last names pick random. All right, save it. If everything's hooked up correctly, I should be able to generate some names. All right, and that's being fed from a resource. So we're going to continue to iterate on this name generator. But before we continue, let's talk about random number generation. So you may know about global functions in Godot like rand_i for a random integer. Those functions under the hood use a global random number generator. And you may not know this, but you can actually create your own random number generator and use it in parallel. One advantage of that is you can seed it with a specific value, and that'll give you some predictability for debugging. So there are some pros and cons with using a pseudo random generator. It's not truly random. It doesn't actually produce random values. It just does its best to simulate random values. But more importantly, when you're developing a game, true randomness may not be really what you're after, and true randomness may not actually be fun. So I'm going to actually propose an alternative, and this is recommended in the Godot documentation. The alternative is called a shuffle bag. So a shuffle bag is an array where you could get random elements out of it, but when the random element is picked, that element is removed from the array. This enforces linear distribution. So every item will only be picked once. So the logic's pretty simple. It's an array that you remove items out of that have been randomly selected. When the count of the array is 0, the array gets reinitialized with all of its initial values again. So let's see what that looks like in code. Alright, so we're back in Godot, and I'm going to create a new script. I'm going to call it shuffle bag. And rather than type this out, I'm actually just going to paste my completed code to save some time, and I'll explain it line by line. So the shuffle bag is going to extend ref counted. You're free to have this extend node, but I find this easier because it's easier for me to think about from a memory management point of view. Basically, as soon as something stops using the shuffle bag, it'll be queued for release and the memory will be freed. That's to me easier than adding it as a child and remembering to queue up a release of the object in the future. But your mileage may vary, but this is how I prefer to construct it. It's going to have two variables, an initial array and then the current bag. It has a function where you populate the array, which sets the array you pass as the initial, and it immediately reshuffles. Reshuffling involves duplicating the initial array, storing it in the bag, and then shuffling the bag. The shuffle bag is now shuffled. It's now randomized. You don't have to do it on every single call to random. Instead, you'll just remove the first item in the array. However, there's a base case. If the array is ever empty, you reshuffle, which means you'll set it to the full array again. So now that we have the shuffle bag, let's go back to our name definition and let's change these to shuffle bags. And what I'm going to do next is a little bit extra, but I think this will be a really nice improvement. Rather than exporting the shuffle bags, I'm going to delete these two lines and make two new variables. A string first name values and a string last name values. Now, what are these going to be used for? These are actually going to be comma delimited strings of first names and last names. What this allows us to do is in the IDE, when we edit the resource, just paste in comma delimited string of names, potentially something we generated in ChatGPT or whatever. It'll just be much easier to edit and insert. So to make these exportable, we don't want to just put export, we actually want to use export multiline. So now that we have our export multiline first name values and last name values, we're going to take the input that we get from the resource and turn them into shuffle bags. So to do that, we're going to set a setter, and to do that I'll just paste the code in and then explain. So we now have a setter which takes in value as a parameter. When first name value is set, the first name shuffle bag is created. We then take the value passed in, which remember is a string, we split by comma, which gives us an array. We then populate, remember this is our new function in our shuffle bag, the shuffle bag with the split values. Do the same thing. Oops. Do the same thing for last names. And we're going to make one more change, which is in main. We're no longer dealing with arrays, we're dealing with our new shuffle bags. So we're going to place this with random, which is our custom function we created in the shuffle bag. Now inside my resource, which you can see on the right here, I've pre-populated with a comma delimited string of first names and last names for a generic human race of a fantasy setting. So if we run, we are now retrieving names out of the resource using the shuffle bag, and the names are populated in the resource in a very easy to edit way. So imagine we have human names. Why don't we support dwarf names, orc names, different tribes, etc. We could go crazy with this. So what we're going to create is a new script. We're going to call it the name repository. So the name repository is going to be a new resource, and this is going to be the centralized place for name generation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to decide, let's create two types of races with an enum. Let's call them human and dwarf. And rather having the reference to the name definition in the main script, we're going to export them here. We're going to call them human names. And we're going to call the second one dwarf names. Now, instead of having a generate function in the main script, let's add it here. Now, the main difference will be we'll take in a race, and depending on the race that we take in, a different name definition will be used. So let's make a variable called names, and this will be set dynamically. We'll match the race. If race is human, we're going to use the human names. If it's dwarf, we're going to use the dwarf names. The rest should be familiar. I'm going to take a random first name, random last name, and then we're going to return a format string. Could have copied this from the main script to save time, but it's almost faster to retype it. So the next step is we're going to create a new resource. We're going to create a new name definition. Call it dwarf names. Let's populate this with some classic dwarf names. Next, let's create another resource. We'll make a new name repository. And all this will be is a reference to the human names and the dwarf names. Alright, let's go back to our main script. And we're going to change this name definition to a name repository. And we're actually going to just comment out the generate function. The reason is this has to compile successfully for Godot to successfully parse this and interpret this line right here. If we select the control here, we'll see that we now have a name repository, and we're going to quick load our name repository. So now our exported name repository is going to be loaded at runtime, and generate can be deleted. And on button press, we're going to use the name repository, call generate, and we're going to pass in a race. So let's pass in name repository.race.dwarf. And let's run that. And we're now getting fantasy dwarf names. Alright, so the next and final step is we're going to add some optional components to the name. So to demonstrate that, we're going to jump back to the name definition. We're going to add a third multi-line text field called middle name values, and a third shuffle bag called middle names. I'm going to jump into our name repository, and I've taken the liberty of adding a middle name generator. Actually, let's jump back here. There's one thing I forgot. We're going to add one additional export, which is chance of middle name. So chance of middle name is going to be a float between 0 and 1.0, which will be 100%. So let's make the default value, let's make it 33%. So 1/3 of names will have a middle name. So now let's jump to our repository. So along with our first and last name, we now have a empty string as the middle name. We're going to generate a random float, so this will be between 0 and 1.0, and if that value is less than the chance of middle name, Then we populate the middle name with a random element of the middle names array. I've taken the liberty of modifying this format string to be first name, middle name, last name. Keep in mind this will create an extra space for names without middle names. Now let's jump to human names, and let's put in some humany middle names. And let's jump to the dwarf names. Let's put in some dwarfy middle names. And let's try this out. And as you can see, about a third of the dwarves have middle names. And that wraps up the code. Let's go over what we learned. Today I went over the basics of random name generation and shuffle bags. We talked about resources and how we could create a name repository. And then quickly we went over how to add optional decorators, prefixes, or other pieces of names to make it a little bit more unique and not just that first name, last name syntax, which could get very repetitive. What could we do next? Well, we could break races further down into tribes, or maybe different countries of origin. Races could have slightly different name formats. Perhaps all goblins use a dash in lieu of spaces, or have multiple middle names. We could generate first names from syllables, or we could generate last names from something like noun plus verb, stone pincher, rock smasher, hammer thrower. Now I really think you could see that the sky's the limit. This is basically the template of how I do all my name generation. Basic randomization and lists of creative options, and you can go really far with that. Hope that was helpful, and see you next time.